Imagine the moment. A conservator working carefully in a laboratory begins to unroll the linen wrappings of an Egyptian mummy roughly 1,600 years old. Layer by layer, the ancient fabric comes away, and then, pressed directly against the remains of a human being, something extraordinary appears. Letters, Greek letters, lines of poetry. Not just any poetry, Homer's Iliad, one of the oldest and most celebrated works of literature in the entire Western world, folded into the bandages of an Egyptian mummy like a piece of scrap paper. In April 2026, researchers announced this find to the world, and almost immediately a question formed that nobody in the English-speaking world has fully answered yet. Why was it there? Was this nothing more than an embalmer reaching for whatever material was cheap and available, a discarded school exercise, a scribal offcut, a page nobody wanted anymore? Or was Homer placed inside that mummy deliberately, with intention, with meaning? And if it was deliberate, what did those words mean to the person who put them there? By the end of this documentary, you will understand not just what was found, but what it reveals about the extraordinary collision between two of the ancient world's greatest civilizations, Greek and Egyptian, and what happened when their ideas about literature, death, and the power of language met inside a single grave. But before we can answer the why, you need to understand something even more surprising. The fact that Homer survived it all is close to a miracle, and Egypt is the only place on Earth where it could have happened. To understand why a fragment of Homer's Iliad survived inside a mummy for 1,600 years, you first need to understand something remarkable about Egypt itself. Egypt is, in a very real sense, the world's greatest accidental library. The reason is simple: the desert. In most of the ancient Mediterranean world, Greece, Italy, Asia Minor, the combination of humidity, rainfall, and soil acidity destroys organic material within centuries. Papyrus rots, linen crumbles, words disappear. But in the bone-dry sands of Egypt, organic material is sealed and preserved in a way that almost nowhere else on Earth can match. Papyrus buried in Egyptian soil has survived not for decades, not for centuries, but for millennia. That single climatic fact is the reason we know as much as we do about the ancient world, and the ancient world wrote a great deal on papyrus, including, over and over again, Homer. Scholars who study ancient manuscripts have long recognized something striking. More papyrus fragments of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey have been recovered from Egypt than fragments of any other ancient author. Homer was the foundational text of Greek education. Children learned to read by copying his lines. Students practiced their handwriting on his verses. Adults who wanted to signal their learning and sophistication quoted him at dinner parties and in public speeches. In the Greek-speaking world, Homer was not simply literature. He was the bedrock of what it meant to be educated, to be cultured, to be civilized. And because Egypt preserved what everywhere else destroyed, it is Egypt that has handed most of that Homeric tradition back to us. Now consider who was living in Egypt when this particular mummy was prepared. By the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, Egypt had been part of the Roman Empire for roughly 300 years. It was a society of extraordinary cultural complexity, a place where Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and increasingly Christian influences overlapped and intertwined. Greek was the language of administration, of education, of prestige. Egyptian Demotic and the emerging Coptic script carried older religious and cultural traditions. Latin echoed through the courts and the military. This was not one civilization, but several, living in the same cities, sharing the same markets, and sometimes sharing the same graves. It is also worth knowing that mummies from this late period are a transitional and relatively rare category. The ancient embalming traditions that had defined Egyptian burial for thousands of years were slowly fading under Roman rule and the spread of Christianity. The mummies that do survive from this era often show that mixture of cultures in striking ways. Greek portrait paintings on Egyptian-style wrapped bodies, Roman names alongside hieroglyphic inscriptions. And then there is cartonnage. This is the term archaeologists use for the layers of papyrus or linen that embalmers glued together and molded directly around a mummy, forming a kind of stiff casing or mask. It is a well-documented practice, and here is the crucial detail. Embalmers frequently used whatever papyrus was available. Old letters, discarded administrative documents, used school exercises, all of it was repurposed as raw material. Finding recycled papyrus inside a mummy is not by itself unusual. What is unusual, what makes this particular find stop researchers in their tracks, is which text was recycled and the questions that identification immediately raises. So we know Egypt preserved papyrus and we know Homer was everywhere, but that still does not explain why this particular fragment ended up inside this particular mummy. To understand that, we need to look more closely at what was actually discovered and how researchers knew what they were looking at. So what exactly was found, and how do we know what it is? In July 2026, an announcement described as major was made public. A fragment of papyrus bearing lines from Homer's Iliad had been identified within the wrappings or cartonnage of an Egyptian mummy. The mummy itself is estimated to date to roughly the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, placing it in the late Roman period of Egyptian history. That is the core of what was reported, and even stated that plainly it is extraordinary. It is worth being honest about what we know and what we do not. As of the time this documentary was produced, full academic details had not yet appeared in widely available English-language reporting. The specific book of the Iliad, the precise lines, the exact institution holding the mummy, these details were either not confirmed in public sources or were still working their way through the slow and careful machinery of scholarly publication. Where specifics are uncertain, we will say so. What is not uncertain is that researchers who study ancient papyri examined this fragment and concluded it was genuinely Homeric. That identification carries real weight. The process of identifying an ancient text like this is painstaking and fascinating in equal measure. Scholars do not simply glance at a scrap of papyrus and declare it Homer. They compare the letter forms, the precise shapes of ancient Greek handwriting, against thousands of other documented examples, building a picture of when and where a particular hand was trained. They examine the ink, the fiber structure of the papyrus itself, and most importantly, the actual words. Ancient Greek texts are cross-referenced against papyrus databases that catalog every fragment recovered from Egypt over more than a century of excavation. When the words on a fragment match lines from a known work, and when the handwriting and material evidence align with the reported date, the identification becomes credible. That process is what researchers applied here. The physical condition of such a find deserves a moment's attention because it shapes everything about how we can study it. Papyrus recovered from mummy contexts is rarely pristine. Centuries of compression, the chemistry of embalming resins, and the slow work of time leave fragments discolored, brittle, and often broken. Reading them frequently requires more than the naked eye. Infrared imaging and multispectral analysis, techniques that reveal ink invisible to ordinary light, are standard tools in this field, though whether they were applied to this specific fragment has not been confirmed in available reporting. What makes this find stand out, even against the rich background of Homer papyri already known from Egypt, appears to be the combination of factors. The mummy context itself, the reported dating, and the state of preservation together seem to be what prompted the announcing institution to describe this as significant. Homer fragments from Egypt are not rare in isolation. Egypt has produced more Homeric papyri than anywhere else on Earth. But a fragment identified within the physical wrappings of a mummy, in the way this one was, is a different category of discovery. It is not just a text, it is a text that was placed with a person, and that is where the story changes register entirely. Researchers can tell us what the text says and roughly when it was written. What they cannot yet tell us with certainty is whether this fragment arrived inside that mummy deliberately, chosen, placed, perhaps even meaningful, or whether it ended up there by chance, a scrap of used papyrus grabbed by an embalmer who needed cheap packing material and gave no thought to what was written on it. That question, deliberate or accidental, is not a small one. The answer would tell us something profound about the person in that mummy, about the world they lived in, and about what Homer meant to the people of Roman Egypt. To really grasp why finding Homer inside a mummy matters, you need to understand what Homer meant to the people who lived in that world, and the answer is almost everything. In the Greco-Roman world, the Iliad and the Odyssey were not simply great literature the way we might think of Shakespeare or Tolstoy today. They were the foundation of an entire civilization's education. Children in the Greek-speaking world learned to read by copying Homer. They learned to write by copying Homer. Schoolboys scratched his lines onto wax tablets and papyrus sheets as their very first exercises in literacy. By the time a Greek-educated person reached adulthood, they were expected to be able to quote the Iliad from memory, not a few famous lines, but substantial passages. Homer was the curriculum. Homer was the standard. Homer was, in a very real sense, what it meant to be educated. Some ancient writers went even further. A number of thinkers in the ancient world explicitly compared Homer's place in Greek culture to the role that sacred scripture played in other traditions. This is not a modern interpretation. It is an opinion that ancient people themselves recorded and debated. Homer was treated as a source of moral wisdom, of theological insight, of answers to life's deepest questions. When ancient writers wanted to settle an argument about how to live or how to die, they reached for Homer the way others reach for holy texts. Now carry that cultural weight into Roman-era Egypt. Greek was the language of administration, commerce, and prestige. The Greek-speaking elite of Roman Egypt used Homer as a social signal, a marker of who they were and where they stood. To be associated with Homer was to announce your education, your refinement, your place in the civilized world. It was cultural currency, as tangible and valuable as any coin. And here is where the mummy becomes genuinely interesting. We know from documented archaeological evidence that the people of Roman-era Egypt regularly buried their dead with objects of personal meaning. Amulets have been found tucked inside wrappings, figurines, personal letters, addressed to the deceased or written by them. Objects that spoke to who the person was in life. The burial was not just a disposal of the body, it was a statement about identity, a final portrait of the person being interred. Which brings us to the first major theory about why this Iliad fragment ended up inside this mummy. Some researchers suggest it may have been placed there deliberately, that the fragment of Homer was included as a marker of the deceased's education and cultural identity. Think of it as burying someone today with a beloved book or a diploma or a handwritten poem. On this reading, whoever was responsible for this burial wanted Homer to accompany the dead into whatever came next, because Homer had defined who that person was in life. But there is a second theory, and it is far less romantic. Papyrus was expensive. Embalmers worked with whatever materials were available and affordable. Scribal workshops produced offcuts, discarded drafts, used school exercises, waste paper essentially, and that waste paper was routinely repurposed as cheap packing and wrapping material. On this reading, the Iliad fragment ended up in the mummy not because anyone chose it, but because it happened to be in a pile of scrap that an embalmer grabbed without a second thought. Homer reduced to stuffing. Both theories are plausible. Both have archaeological precedent in other finds from Roman Egypt. Neither can be confirmed for this specific mummy with the information currently available. But here is what makes this story even more layered. There is a third possibility that researchers are only beginning to take seriously, and it involves the way the ancient Egyptians thought about words, death, and the power of language itself. There is a third explanation for why Homer ended up inside that mummy, and it is the one that reaches deepest into the ancient Egyptian mind. To understand it, you have to set aside the modern idea that literature and religion are separate things. In ancient Egypt, they never were. For thousands of years before this mummy was wrapped, Egyptians had been placing texts with their dead. The most famous example is the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, hymns, and instructions written on papyrus and tucked into coffins or pressed against the body. These were not decorative, they were functional. The Egyptians believed that words, written down and placed in the right location, carried genuine power, power to protect the soul, to navigate the dangers of the afterlife, to speak on behalf of the dead when no living voice could. The written word was not a record of something sacred, it was the sacred thing itself. Now consider what was happening in Egypt by the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. The old traditions were not dying quietly, they were blending. Scholars use the term syncretism to describe what was taking place in Roman period Egypt, a slow, complex mixing of Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and increasingly Christian beliefs and practices. You can see it in the mummies from this era, which sometimes carry Greek portrait paintings on their faces while their bodies are wrapped in the old Egyptian style. The boundaries between cultures were genuinely porous. In this context, some researchers have raised a speculative but historically grounded question. Could Homer's words have been understood by at least some people in Roman-era Egypt as carrying the same kind of protective power that Egyptian funerary spells traditionally carried? It is important to be clear, this is a theory, not an established fact. There is no surviving document in which an ancient person explicitly states they placed Homer in a grave as a protective charm. That direct evidence does not exist. But here is what does exist. Scholars have long studied a remarkable collection of ancient Greek texts from Egypt known as the Greek Magical Papyri, or the PGM corpus. These documents, which date broadly from the 2nd century BCE through the 5th century CE, are genuine magical handbooks, recipes for spells, rituals, and incantations. And within them, researchers have found quotations from Homer woven directly into magical formulae. Homer's lines were not just literary ornaments in these texts, they appear to have been treated as words with power. That documented reality makes the speculation at least historically plausible. The Iliad itself is, after all, a poem saturated with death. It is about warriors falling, about the fate of the soul after the body fails, about the grief of those left behind and the strange suspended existence of those who have crossed over. For someone living at the intersection of Egyptian and Greek traditions, someone who grew up believing that words could shepherd the dead, reaching for Homer in a moment of burial might not have felt strange at all. It might have felt entirely right. Whether it was a status symbol, recycled scrap, or something closer to a spiritual act, we cannot know for certain which of these explanations fits this specific mummy. What we can say is that each one of them tells us something profound, that literature and mortality have always been tangled together, and that the people of the ancient world understood, in ways we are still trying to articulate, that some words are simply too powerful to leave behind. And that forces us to ask the biggest question of all. What does it mean that a poem written about a war in the Bronze Age was still so alive, so present, 16 centuries later, that it ended up sealed inside someone's grave? So where does that leave us? We have walked through 3 explanations for why Homer's Iliad ended up inside an Egyptian mummy for roughly 1,600 years. The first, it was placed there deliberately, as a marker of the deceased's education, their identity, their status, the ancient equivalent of burying someone with a treasured book. The second, it was nothing more than cheap packing material, scribal waste repurposed by an embalmer who may never have paused to read a single line. And the third, in a world where Egyptian and Greek traditions had been blending for centuries, Homer's words about heroic death and the fate of warriors may have carried a kind of spiritual weight, not so different in the minds of some from the sacred spells that Egyptians had been placing with their dead for thousands of years. 3 theories, each one plausible, each one supported by broader historical evidence, and for this specific mummy, none of them yet confirmed. That honesty matters. Good history does not rush to a tidy answer just because the question is compelling. What we can say with confidence is this: The find announced in 2026 is a genuine reminder that the ancient world was far more interconnected, far more culturally layered than any simple story can capture. A Greek poem born from an oral tradition stretching back approximately 2,700 years or more, found resting inside an Egyptian mummy in a Roman-era burial. That is not a footnote. That is civilization. Much still remains unknown. The full identity of the mummy, the precise provenance of the find, and the complete academic analysis are details that researchers will likely be working through for months, possibly years. As that picture comes into focus, the story will deepen, and perhaps the most remarkable thing of all is simply this: Homer is still here. Fragments of the Iliad are still surfacing in the most unexpected corners of the ancient world, still being read, still being argued over, still mattering, which may be the most honest answer we have to the question of why that papyrus ended up in that grave. Because Homer mattered, deeply, personally, and perhaps even eternally, to the people who lived alongside those words. That is not nothing. That is everything. If you want to be here when the full academic report on this find is published and we break it down in detail, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is exactly the kind of story this channel follows closely, and leave a comment below. Which of the three explanations do you find most convincing? The status symbol, the recycled scrap, or the magical protection? The investigation into this mummy has barely begun, and the best answers may still be waiting in the dust.